Thank you very much. And let's move on. There was a speech by Marek Doyle yesterday when he spoke about the fundamentals of health and the importance of testing. And today is the Q&A session that will follow the speech. So if you have seen the speech yesterday, perhaps you can recall your questions and get ready. Marek will be available for some 15-20 minutes. So feel free to ask. So help me welcome Marek. Thank you.
Sveiki. So for those of you who saw my talk yesterday, as per warning at the start, it was always going to be a complicated subject. So that's why I wanted to hear any questions that you may well have, questions that we weren't able to take yesterday. So, yeah, is there anybody who wants to take the brave step of asking the first question?
Just a moment.
Hi, thank you for your presentation yesterday. It was great. And I myself have come in contact with people called endobiogenics. Okay. I don't know if you've heard of them.
I haven't.
Basically people that do pretty much the same thing. They take your blood tests and then they apply it to some specific patented system, and then they have a lot of bioparameters that they could, establish what's wrong with you. And basically, they told me that there was a thing with me called adrenal fatigue. Mm-hmm. And I started researching it, and I know that the medical community doesn't really, confirm that it's a medical issue. So I was just wondering, what's your take on it, and how would you approach in actually finding out if it's actually an issue with a person, like what parameters you would test, and how you would treat it.
Okay, well, it's a great question, and obviously the phrase adrenal fatigue is one that carries a lot more weight now. I don't think that necessarily everybody is familiar with that, but it's certainly a very popular phrase within alternative healthcare in particular. So nutritional therapists, acupuncturists, and the like, those are the practitioners who are very, very likely to be familiar with that phrase. So for those of you in the audience that aren't necessarily familiar with adrenal fatigue, this is a phrase that was originally coined by a doctor called James Wilson from America. And he wrote this book, Adrenal Fatigue, 21st Century Stress Syndrome. And this was released in 1992. And in the early stages, what we were seeing is that there were a lot of individuals who were feeling the same cluster of symptoms, fatigue obviously being the major factor, but also brain fog, lack of ability to sustain any sort of stress, poor sleep, very slow wound healing, excessive bruising, cold hands and feet, dizziness upon standing, low blood pressure, and a variety of minor afflictions that, when put together, were simply taking over their life. They applied the steps outlined in Dr. Wilson's book, and a lot of them got a whole lot better. Thus, this movement behind adrenal fatigue, solving our problems, became a lot more popular. Now, the problem is, of course, the explanations given didn't make any sense, or there was no backup for them. And so we saw this very hostile reaction from mainstream medicine. And there was lots of doctors undertaking exposés on adrenal fatigue isn't real. And it got very much a case of a team. You took a side. You either agreed with the doctors and the science that it's not real and these people need to stop bleating, or alternatively, you actually thought, well, it doesn't necessarily explain it, but people are getting better. Anyhow, I actually put an article on my website, and that looked into the physiology behind adrenal fatigue. And regardless of what we call it, the symptoms are very, very real, and they're very, very measurable. So, as you may well recall, if you have seen my presentation yesterday, I explained how whenever the stress response is activated, we're not just activating the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. That's one of the things that's happening. But principally, there is the innate, hardwired nervous response, the sympathetic nerve which connects your brain to various parts of your body, and that gets you ready to fight or run. Now, one of those factors, as I mentioned yesterday, is the opening up of the gut lining. When that gut lining opens up, yes, you can get more sugar and salt in. That was going to help. But you're also getting those endotoxins. You're also getting fragments of bacteria, which drives this huge, often disproportionate inflammatory response. And that's the physiology of adrenal fatigue. Now, there's a 2016 paper that proves adrenal fatigue isn't real. How did they do that? They went to a public database of scientific papers and typed in adrenal fatigue. And guess what? It came back with no mentions, because it's not the medical phrase. Hypocortisolism, that's a word. Hypoadrenalism, that's a word. You put those in and you'll see multiple results. And I've actually put together a document that shows 26 different scientific papers which prove how low cortisol response will mean that the stress response doesn't get turned off the way we would expect. And as a consequence, we end up with sustained opening of the gut lining, sustained movement of those endotoxins, sustained inflammation, which of course deregulates the entire system, and that's of course the adrenal fatigue. So yes, there is scientific support for it. There's scientific support for every single step within that diagram of physiology that I offered yesterday on the screen, but also in the article that I mentioned. And finally, how do we test for it? Well, the easiest way is an adrenal stress index profile. It's a salivary test which you can get from Genova. They send it into Europe. There's also a number of other labs in America that offer it, but they all call it the adrenal stress profile or a variation on that. So a 4-point salivary test. In the last year, we've seen the addition of 6-point saliva tests, but they're both very suitable to give us a really good snapshot of what's going on with the two main hormones at the adrenals, cortisol and DHEA. Anyone who understands that will be able to determine, is your cortisol response appropriate for the stress you're under? And that's the key thing. It's never a case of high cortisol good, low cortisol bad. It's a case of, is this an adaptive response to the stress you're under? So that's how I would start. There's multiple other factors that you can test, such as ACTH, adrenocorticotropin, a hormone that directly activates the adrenals. In the coming years, I suspect we'll be able to get a commercial test for alpha amylase, which will be a great marker, because that will basically tell us, how stressed are you? Alpha amylase always corroborates and tracks the CRH that's released. So I hope that gives you an idea of what adrenal fatigue is, the reasons why a lot of people within mainstream medicine dismiss the idea despite the scientific support for it, and equally your testing options.
Hi. I know it's a huge subject, but maybe you can explain briefly, scientifically, what is obesity?
Okay, so obesity. Okay, how long do we have? So I think the easiest things to do with obesity is to first touch on the rate-limiting factor behind burning fat, and then discuss the most useful concepts to view obesity. So that's what I'm going to try and do to convey an accurate message without going on a half-an-hour rant. So when we actually release fat from our cells, this is a very highly regulated process, because as you can imagine, evolution has determined that there are times when we need to access the energy stored beneath our skin. But if it continually comes out without regulation, we're at risk of starvation. So there has to be some sort of defense to stop it from coming out of the skin so freely. By the skin, I'm talking about this subcutaneous stores. So the enzyme in control of that is AMPK. Now, let's not worry too much about the name, but what is important is that so many of the mechanisms that we talk about when it comes to fat loss, they activate this one enzyme. And we can collectively call this the AMPK pathway. Thyroid hormones, huge factor, but they're limited by whether they turn on the AMPK response. Adrenaline, another factor, but again, it's only in providing a signaling cascade to this one enzyme. Herein lies the problem. If there is any perceived starvation, your brain will deliberately downregulate that enzyme. Meaning that it doesn't matter if you throw in all the thyroid hormones in the world. It doesn't matter if you use pre-workout stimulants to amp up this sympathetic response, the amount of adrenaline that's released. It doesn't matter if you use green tea and yohimbe and these various thermogenics. Because yes, they're going to have some impact, but all that's going to do is come up against this wall laid down by your brain very intelligently, which knows that if it perceives that you have starvation, it's really important to downregulate that enzyme. What's also fascinating is the role of inflammation. Inflammation will automatically downregulate the responsiveness of that enzyme, which makes sense. If you have a massive drain on your resources, you don't want to be giving them up willy-nilly. And so it makes sense that over the course of evolution, those that actually started to defend their fat stores over time, well, they're the ones that actually lived through the winter. So we've identified, yes, there's lots of factors that will influence fat burning, but they're not going to have a fair chance of working if your brain perceives that it's being starved. And that leaves us on to the best way to look at obesity, which is as a starvation disorder. Now, what if your cells are more than capable of recognizing the energy and taking them in? And that generally happens. Evolution would not have selected for individuals who are not capable of storing fat easily. However, under no period of time throughout evolution was there any selection pressure to abstain from this development whereby your hypothalamus can start becoming dysregulated. It can stop reading the signals that it's being sent by the body. I touched on one yesterday, leptin. Leptin is a hormone released from fat cells beneath the skin. And it communicates with the brain, we are good. We have plenty of energy. Your hypothalamus receives that. And it's not the only signal, but it's a very, very important one. And that tells the hypothalamus, go ahead and do your thing. If you want to invest in the digestive function, go ahead. If you want to invest in lighting up all areas of the brain, go ahead. If you want to burn fat, go ahead. We're fine. Problems occur when that signal is not received, in which case, whether you are holding a lot of fat or not, your hypothalamus perceives that you are hours from death. And guess what? It just locks down its fat stores. And that's one of the reasons why, despite there being, 160 years now gone by since the first diet book, which was a letter on corpulence. That was released in the middle of the 19th century, which proposed that reducing food and increasing exercise might actually be a solution to obesity. Here we are, thousands of studies later, tens of billions of dollars later, not one study supports that other than very, very short term. And it's because you're not dealing with the baseline causes, which is that your hypothalamus wants and needs an increase in fat storage. So it will promote fat storage and it will block fat liberation. Does that help you?
Yes, and how do you solve that?
So we look at the underlying basics. So are they capable of regulated energy metabolism? So typically I'm going to start at the mitochondria. I'm going to be looking for blockages in using energy. If someone's short of B1, for example, the enzyme that moves carbohydrates into the cell cannot get into the mitochondria. So all of a sudden, you have a backlog. This is a huge problem because you've now got areas that are being starved, but you've also got other areas of the body that have got a backlog of energy. That's energy dysregulation. Suddenly, there's various steps being made to store energy because we're starving, and there's also various areas that are actually inducing insulin resistance, saying we can't take any more energy. So there's a big connection between that B1 shortage, a change in the way the body uses energy, and changes in the metabolism, chronic energy disorders. Now, that's just one potential way it can play out. But that's how I would look in the mitochondria. There's lots of different ways that it can happen. Testing is so vital because whilst I can spot mitochondrial problems a mile off, I don't know whether that's a B1 issue, CoQ10, carnitine, B2, because it will all present in a very similar way. So yeah, we test, we determine what is actually the rate-limiting factor at the mitochondria. Now, what if it's to do with inflammation affecting energy signaling? If that's the case, we need to get control of inflammation rather than jumping straight into, well, let's boost adrenal output, let's look at glutathione, let's look at vitamin B, vitamin D, vitamin A. I would actually rather look at what's the sources. So many people with long-term inflammation have oxalate issues. Most of the people here probably don't know what oxalates are. If I was you, and that applies to you, I would go onto Google and put in my name and then oxalates, and you'll get an article just to outline what oxalates are. But in short, they're a food chemical that our bodies should handle and we shouldn't need to worry about. But if digestion's going wrong, suddenly they start entering the body and causing inflammation. Now, some people are sensitive to lectins, another food chemical. It's not as common, but it's common enough to rear its head again and again in people that I work with. Some people will find that their environment is the biggest factor, and I'm mainly talking about mold exposure. Over 60% of my clients actually have mold exposure. That probably doesn't apply to the population at large, because by definition, people are coming to see me for a reason, because they feel awful. But that's a common thing. But finally, the one thing that applies to almost everybody to some extent, maybe a bit, maybe a lot, is dysbiosis, gut health, the microbiome. If that is imbalanced, you're going to have a continual 24/7 agitation of your immune response, which amounts to inflammation. And will that now impact the hypothalamus? If so, we cannot expect your hypothalamus to read signals effectively. So, yeah, I'm always focused initially on energy metabolism, inflammation.
Okay, if it's mitochondria, how do you measure? Blood test or?
So there's a variety of ways to do it, but my favorite way is organic acids. Is it the best? There's always variety of different ways to look at various tests, but it's very easy. It's very simple. You get 73 different markers across a whole range of body systems, and it gives you some very valuable information on what's going on at the mitochondria. Specifically, what's short, or to translate it into the language that I used yesterday, what's the rate-limiting factor in mitochondrial performance? And the organic acid test that I prefer to use is the one offered by Great Plains Laboratory. They're in America.
Thank you.
Let's do the last question before we have a break. Is there anyone in the audience?
Just something you were saying just now, with about how if your body is burning fat very quickly, it tells your hippocampus that it's that you're burning it too fast, so it kind of closes it down. I was wondering if there's any negative effects of a ketogenic diet then, because you hear a lot of people, they start ketosis and they burn fat very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if there's, I don't know, some negative effects of ketosis. I've heard someone say previously also that, for someone that has a ketogenic diet, they have kids, pretty much through their genes, their kids have learned that, we're in the starving state all the time, so their kids are going to have some sort of obese gene right away.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've heard
So,
of?
so yes, I actually recommend the ketogenic diet quite regularly. I would say that there's about 40% of people I see, I will end up employing the ketogenic diet. If compliance was not an issue, I would probably recommend it more. And I think the ketogenic diet is a really good area to see this conformational bias play out in the natural healthcare world, because there generally does tend to be the two camps. Those that love ketosis, that tell us this is the optimal human state, and everybody should be in ketosis. And then, of course, you've got the other camp who say, well, ketosis is a starvation state. Plus, my doctor told me it was dangerous. Now, first of all, when doctors say ketosis is dangerous, they're actually confusing nutritional ketosis with diabetic ketoacidosis. They're two very, very different things. We won't bother going into the differences right now. But in terms of, does ketogenesis and a ketogenic diet, does that cause starvation in response in the brain? No. I've actually seen that as an excellent tool to get around the energy mismanagement. Because for a lot of people, especially obese individuals, we know they have an energy metabolism problem. We know that their brain thinks they're starved, and that's why it's overly defending their fat. Now, without getting too complex into it, the easiest way to restore that leptin sensitivity is A, to take those steps to remove inflammation, B, to check those energy pathways aren't being blocked by a shortage, and then to undertake a reset, undertake a diet that nourishes them without the need for high levels of insulin. Insulin, adrenaline, and leptin, they tend to work as a three. If one's high, it very rarely occurs that the others don't actually become high as well. So if you lose sensitivity to one, it's very rare that you won't lose sensitivity to the others. So if we can actually provide a low stress, low insulin diet, and the ketogenic diet is absolutely ideal in that regard, then we actually provide an opportunity for the hypothalamus to become resensitized and actually recognize the truth that, hey, actually, there's loads of energy. I don't need to defend anything. And suddenly, off it goes. And we see that all the time. Problems often occur for people in the transition into ketosis. There is one major issue with a ketogenic diet, which is that in order to get into ketosis, you need to provide your liver with a very high fat intake and low carbohydrate availability. In other words, you need to take away those carbs before those liver enzymes can start going to work. Why is that a problem? Well, your brain can only function on carbs, glucose, or ketones. It's a bit of a generalization, but it bears out. So it needs one of the two, and we have to take one of those away in order for the liver to start producing the other and feeding the brain. I measured 20 people who came to me on a ketogenic diet over the course of 3 years. And the first thing I asked all of them to do is measure your ketones. What are your ketones giving us? 19 out of 20 were not in ketosis. And this is a potential problem because that's where starvation is occurring at the area that matters. Your brain is not receiving enough fuel to maintain normal function. So that's where the transition needs to be managed properly. Easiest way to do that is to warm up your liver enzymes, to train them using C8 oil ahead of the transition into a ketogenic diet. But the biggest golden rule with a ketogenic diet is measure your ketones. Not with urinary strips, they're mainly useless, but either a blood monitor or a breathalyzer both of which are going to be a really handy tool so that you know your central nervous system is actually being fueled, because that's where we've got the risk of starvation. But once people are in ketosis, I see it as a fantastic tool. The major downside is that you lose athletic capacity. But as a health tool, it's one of the most powerful interventions that I've got in my locker. And whilst I don't tend to ever leave people on a keto diet, they should be able to do just as well on carbs once we resolve the metabolic issues. The reset function of ketosis is fantastic, but it's also directly anti-inflammatory. And at physiological levels, you actually see experiments that show 39% more blood flow into the central nervous system. That's a huge increase in blood and mainly oxygen. People's brains work better in those instances. So yeah, hugely powerful tool, lots of myths out there. As per usual, the aficionados aren't entirely right. The naysayers, they need to check their facts. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, as per usual.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paldies.
Thanks, Marek.
Thank you very much.
If you have more